So we'll move on to our next virtual keynote. So live from New York, we have Jonathan Schaffer on Lewis on What Else There Is. Hello.
So thank you, Al, and Helen, and Dylan, and thanks all for joining the conversation. This is the Lewis Needs Grounding talk. I was expecting to disagree more with Frederick and Fraser, but actually I found little to disagree with in their talk. My claim is not that Lewis did posit grounding, but that he should have. So my point of departure is a famous passage from the introduction to Phil Paper's V2, when Lewis, introducing his doctrine of Humean supervenience, says, all there is to the world is a vast mosaic of local matters of particular fact, just one little thing and then another, and then he adds soon after, all else supervenes on that. And this passage is prima facie puzzling in ways that actually point to a lot of the issues that are going to be arising. I mean, Lewis is Aquinian, so ontology for Lewis is about what there is. So if all there is just one little thing and then another, then what could Lewis be talking about when he talks about all else? It almost sounds like Meinongian talk of things that do not exist. Though, of course, if you know your Lewis, you'll know that that's not what he means. But what exactly does he mean? So here's what I want to say. What Lewis really means is that all there is fundamentally is one little thing and then another, and that all else is grounded in that. But that's something that he cannot say without the ideology of grounding, which is ideology that he disowns, but he's close to. He considers ontological priority at various points as something that he could adopt. And so what I'm going to argue is that that's the direction he should have gone in. So let me start off with Lewis's hierarchical ontology. This is section 1. So the way that I'm understanding the key portion of Lewis that I want to make sense of is in terms of a kind of hierarchical ontology, where we have what I'll call a sparse fundamental basis, which consists of the many atomic individuals. But that's not all. There's also the what else there is. There's also some kind of abundant derivative superstructure, and for Lewis, this will involve at least the mereological fusions and the singletons. Okay, so we can think of this as a doctrine with 3 components. There's atomism, which is the claim that there's a base ontology of many atomic individuals. And I want to think of this as a kind of aspect of Lewis's Humean outlook, though, of course, Lewis's Humean outlook also involves certain claims about the nomological and the modal, which I'm not making any assumptions about here. So there's this claim about what the base individuals are, but then there's also this claim that there are these 2 kinds of generative operations at loose in the ontology that are making more entities out of our base entities. And these generative operations are the fusion operation and the singleton operation. And I want to just note in passing, though I won't dwell on this here, that Lewis has very, very different attitude towards fusion than he does towards singleton. Lewis treats fusion and generally treats the principles of classical mereology as perfectly, this is a quote, perfectly understood, unproblematic, and certain, but he's deeply concerned about set theory, in particular about singleton formation, regarding it as a deeply mysterious necessary connection, but something we must accept given modest deference to mathematics. Lewis goes at various points for structuralist and side-based representations of the singleton function. I don't think these work very well. I don't think that Lewis's concerns about the singleton function are very pressing. I kind of agree with John Burgess, who kind of accuses Lewis of grousing and kvetching like a Goodmanian here. But I'm just going to return to the matter of necessary connections at the end. For now, I'm just going to invoke the singleton function. I'm not going to worry about whether we have to earn a right to invoke the singleton function in non-set theoretic terms. I'm just going to assume we have a right to it one way or another. But one of the points that's going to emerge is that Lewis is often insistent on using purely mereological ideology including in his very account of which necessary connections are tolerable, those between mereologically distinct existence. And one of the things that I'm just wondering about, and I want to kind of pose as a question, is why Lewis accords special privilege to mereological ideology. What's so special about part-whole talk? Okay, so but let me continue forward. Lewis often invokes the images of the tiles in the mosaic, and as well as the images of the pixels in the picture. The tiles / pixels are said to be the sparse unreduced basis, what Ned Hall in his Stanford Encyclopedia entry on Lewis's metaphysics describes as, quote, the fundamental ontological structure of the world. Whereas the mosaic or the picture is said to be abundant or supervenient or reduced or nothing over and above its constituent tiles or pixels. And I've got a quote from Lewis here. This is from Reduction in Mind. Lewis says, imagine a grid of 1 million tiny spots, pixels, each of which can be made light or dark. When some are light and some are dark, they form a picture replete with interesting intrinsic gestalt properties. The case evokes reductionist comments. Yes, the picture really does exist. Yes, it really does have those gestalt properties. However, the picture and the properties reduce to the arrangement of light and dark pixels. They are nothing over and above the pixels. They make nothing true that is not already made true by the pixels. They could go unmentioned in an inventory of the world without thereby rendering that inventory incomplete. So just to clarify, I'm focusing only on the hierarchical and reductive aspect of Lewis's ontology, and so I'm leaving a lot of other matters of Lewis's metaphysics off the table, including how to theorize about possibilities, properties, and propositions. Of course, Lewis goes in for a kind of modal realism here, but he sees that as a further choice point, and I want to leave that to the side, in part because a lot of us will be interested in the extent to which we can defend atomism without having to indulge in modal realism. Lewis is also open to there being further derivative individuals. Wholes, not with a W, is an example that comes up in Lewis's own work. We see Argall defending the claim that there are no holes, but Bargall agrees that there are holes, though Bargall identifies holes with hole linings. But there's also the view of Casati and Varzi, which goes to a more kind of supervenience view that says that holes are dependent upon, not identical to, but dependent upon the distribution of surrounding matter, being what Casati and Varzi call ontological parasites. And I'm also leaving, as I mentioned earlier, just not commenting on whether there's anything worrisome about either fusion or singleton. What I do want to point out, though, is that Lewis's notion of reduction seems to have, which seems to crop up in both the case of fusion and singleton, has a kind of a unified content. Lewis himself thinks there's a unified notion here. I just want to clarify in intuitive terms why I think he's right to say that. And I should say that in doing this, I'm going to be making some claims about counterfactuals and explanations that I think are intuitively right, but that I'm not going to try to root through Lewis's own theories on the topic. Particularly in the case of explanation, Lewis has a theory that's limited just to causal explanation. So he actually has no theory of metaphysical explanation or mathematical explanation, et cetera, that we could invoke. And I want to emphasize as well that I'm concerned, I'm just spotting Lewis, his first order views on mereology and set theory. For the record, I like the view on mereology. I don't like the view on set theory very much. I'm rather concerned with the second order question of understanding what these views involve, and whether to best understand them as Lewis does in supervenience or in ground theoretic terms. And I should say that I think this is a generally very interesting question, in part because Lewis's atomist picture has a lot of plausibility to it. And for those of us who want to accept claims like there are hands, and sort of general Morean modesty, and also want to say, let's say that there are particles, we face a kind of Euthyphro question. Whether do the hands exist because their composing particles exist, or should we think that the particles exist because the hands they compose exist? And I think of the Lewis's atomistic stance as taking a plausible position that the particles come before the hands, and they're the reason why we find the hands. And I should also say that I'm interested in how this plays out in a Lewisian framework. Well, partly because this is a Lewis conference, but also because I just think there's a lot that's generally plausible and interesting in Lewis's framework. And also, and this is a testament to Lewis's excellence, the framework is very clear and tightly controlled. So we can kind of pose the question of how the more fundamental basis is supposed to relate to the derivative superstructure in a very controlled environment. Okay, so, right, so I think it's just intuitively appropriate in this environment to say that the fusions and the singletons on Lewis's picture are not part of the fundamental image of reality. They are, as Lewis says, they're what else there is. They're the supervenient stuff. They're not the tiles of the mosaic, but they're what kind of, loosely speaking, emerges when you align the tiles in this way. Moreover, second point, that fusions and the singletons are both generated from the atomic individuals as the outputs of specified operations, fusion and singleton. Moreover, there's a certain kind of, I think, just intuitive dependence here. If we wiggle which atomic individuals exist, we will wiggle which fusions there are and which singletons there are. So if we have the atomic individual Anne, and we delete Anne from existence, we will delete, as a kind of result, all the fusions that were made partly out of Anne, and we'll delete Anne's singleton. And finally, there's a certain kind of metaphysical explanation that's just there for the taking. Supposing that Anne and Ben exist, let's say they're among the atomic individuals, they are among the tiles of the mosaic. I think there's just a good non-causal explanation as to why the sum of Anne and Ben exists, as to why singleton Anne exists, and as to why singleton Ben exists, and also as to why these sums and singletons are necessarily connected. They all exist because Anne exists and Ben exists. To put it another way, if you were to look out at Lewis's world and notice, wow, there are fusions here, and wow, there are singletons here, and wonder, how did they get there? I think, so if you found that there was, let's just say you found that there's singleton Anne loose in the world, and wonder, how'd she get there? If you find out that there's Anne as an atomic individual, and that there's an operation of singleton formation that maps Anne to singleton Anne, I think that's all you need to know to remove the mystery of how singleton Anne came into the world. So I've got a little, for those of you who know structural equation models and directed acyclic graphs, I put a little graph of the structure of the kind of dependence picture that I think is natural to assume on a Lewis view at the bottom of page 1. I won't talk about that here, but I just want to emphasize that within Lewis's framework, there is a natural hierarchical picture, what Lewis will call reduction, that relates the fusions and the singletons down to the atomic individuals. And now in section 2, I want to try to make sense of Lewis's notion of reduction. So here off we go to section 2. What we'll see is that Lewis disowns notions of ontological priority, or notions which I'm thinking of as roughly equivalent to grounding for present purposes, and tries to do things with identity and supervenience and some other stuff, and I don't think any of it works for him. So this section is going to be a critical section. Lewis's account of reduction doesn't work. We'll need something else, which will be grounding, of course. Okay, so what Lewis first reaches for, I think historically, is identity. He starts off from the view, which he later disowns, that composition is identity. And so he thinks that at that point, he's thinking the sense in which the fusion is nothing over and above its parts is the very literal sense in which the fusion just is its parts. And I think this comes out really nicely in a letter to that Lewis wrote to Keith Campbell, which I want to thank Anthony Fisher for drawing to my attention. Thanks, Anthony. In which Lewis is explicitly rejecting a notion of ontological priority here because he thinks there's an identity connection. So Lewis writes to Campbell, I like to think of composition as a kind of identity. The relation of the many parts to the one whole they compose is many-one identity. They are it. It is them. Now, you wouldn't expect something to be in any sense prior to itself, would you? And likewise, in the case of many-one identity, there's no difference between the many parts and the one whole, therefore no room for priority, which always means priority of one thing to another. Okay? So here we see Lewis embracing the identity view, and also, important to side, using it as a first reason to reject applying a notion of ontological priority to the case. And there's two things to say about this. First, Lewis, as well as Armstrong, initially maintained that when you have symmetric supervenience, you have identity. So they infer, following Baxter, that the parts, taken plurally, are identical to the whole. And I think it's right that that view would support a strongly reductive, nothing over and above conclusion. There really are just the tiles. Everything is identical to the tiles. But there's some problems with that. The first problem, which will recur when we get to supervenience, is that identity is, of course, symmetric. So we could equally, just as well say, if the parts are identical to the whole, we could just as well say that the whole reduces to the parts as we could that the parts reduce to the whole. So any sense in which the tiles have any kind of primacy or are the base ontology, or any sense in which we're saying that the mosaic is the reduced element of the pair, is just lost because we've just got pure symmetry. Okay, so first problem. Second problem is that, as those of you who know Lewis will know, by the time Lewis gets to parts of classes and he's working out his views of set theory, he comes to reject the view that composition is identity. As he points out, well, the many are many and the one is one, and I think maybe more tellingly, there's no natural generalization of Leibniz's law arising in the many-one case. So instead, Lewis at this point retreats to the weaker, I think more plausible view that composition is merely analogous to normal one-one identity in certain ways. But as virtually every commentator, I think Peter van Inwagen might have been the first in the literature to make this point, as virtually every commentator points out, Lewis then loses his claim that composition is really ontologically innocent, and that the whole really is nothing over and above the parts in any straightforward way. After all, if we don't have literal identity, then the composite output is really a new individual that's just not literally identical with any thing or things that we found on the input side of the fusion operation. We've got something genuinely new. But there's a second problem here, which comes out as soon as we start looking at fusion and singleton together as joint reductive operations in the Lewisian framework, which most commentators have tended to treat these matters separately. And the problem here is that the identity view just will not work for the case of singletons, at least in the orthodox set theory that Lewis is explicitly aiming to recover. We cannot identify a singleton set with its one and only member. That would collapse Socrates, singleton Socrates, the singleton of singleton Socrates, etc. It would directly violate Zermelo's axiom of regularity, which states that every non-empty set A contains an element that is disjoint from A. I should mention Quine has some techniques for associating the singleton with its member, but they don't work, and they work only under a battery of restrictive assumptions, and Lewis himself rejects this technique for this reason. So I think actually this is a really interesting case where looking at mereology and set theory together pays off. Okay, so Lewis retreats from identifying the derivative with the fundamental to what I think is his more considered view, where he joins people like Frank Jackson in thinking of the relation as a claim of supervenience. So originally, Lewis just kind of flatly identifies supervenience with reduction. This is a passage from New Work for a Theory of Universals. Lewis says a supervenience thesis is, in a broad sense, reductionist, but it is a stripped-down form of reductionism, unencumbered by dubious denials of existence, claims of ontological priority. Here again, he's rejecting ontological priority, or claims of translatability. One might wish to say that in some sense the beauty of statues is nothing over and above the shape and size and color that beholders appreciate, but without denying that there is such a thing as beauty, without claiming that beauty exists only in some less than fundamental way, and without undertaking to paraphrase ascriptions of beauty in terms of shape, etc. A supervenience thesis seems to capture what the cautious reductionist wishes to say. So I just want to note here, Lewis has this idea of what the cautious reductionist wishes to say, and is making a substantive claim that this can be understood in terms of supervenience. There's an interesting connection here with meaning postulates. Both Terry Horgan, David Lewis, and a number of other people say that any further entities can only come into the world via meaning postulates. And Lewis treats supervenience claims not as establishing identities, but as establishing, this came up in Fraser and Frederick's talk, establishing meaning-giving, albeit potentially infinitary, conceptual analyses, just disjoin all the worlds in which the supervenient is found. So we can think of Lewis, and I think Frank Jackson as well, as converging on an understanding of reduction in terms of conceptual analysis at this point. This is a point that's sort of maybe been beaten to death in the resulting grounding literature, so I'll go kind of quickly over it. I think it's quite clear that we can't just understand reduction in terms of supervenience. The first problem is that supervenience is a reflexive and non-asymmetric relation. So we just don't get any guarantee that we get directionality out of supervenience relations. Indeed, in the mereological case, Armstrong, when he was claiming an identity between the whole, one identity between the whole and its parts, claimed it on grounds that there was symmetric supervenience between the whole and its parts. And so if that's right, then we would as much reduce the whole to its parts as we would reduce the parts to their whole. So we need something more directed here, I think, to get any real conception of reduction. But I think the problem is even clearer when we turn to the case of singleton formation. And here again, I think it really is useful to look at fusion and singleton side by side within a general Lewisian reductive framework, because the singleton relation is 1-1. And in a world where you have Socrates, you're going to have singleton Socrates and vice versa. So you've just got a clear kind of symmetric supervenience between the existence of the thing and the existence of its singleton. But, again, to use Armstrong's nice phrase of the Euthyphro question, it's quite clear, as Fine has pointed out in some of the early literature on grounding and ontological dependence, it's quite clear what the direction of dependence or reduction is here, especially if we think of the singleton as the output of the operation and the thing as the input to the operation. It's quite clear that it's the singleton that is nothing over and above, or is in some sense reduced to, or I'd like to say dependent upon the thing, and not vice versa. So I think Lewis's considered view takes this in and looks for a kind of asymmetric supervenience of the large upon the small and many. And this is from Reduction in Mind. This is, to my knowledge, one of the final places where Lewis really discusses reduction in detail. So he says, and he's thinking of the mind, he's thinking of the pixel case in relation to the case of mind and matter. And he says, of the pixel case, the supervenience is asymmetric. Not just any difference in the pixels would matter to the Gestalt properties of the picture. And it is supervenience of the large upon the small and many. In such a case, say I, supervenience is reduction. Okay. So this is, I think, an improvement in that we get a kind of direction to reduction. But as a first comment, the particular direction chosen of the large and unified to the small and many seems just ad hoc stipulation. You might think it's conceivable that the one large thing could be more fundamental than the many small things. Indeed, I think many monistic philosophers in history have held a view like that. We shouldn't rule that out of court by stipulation. So it just seems ad hoc to say that that's the true direction of reduction. That ought to follow from some more general directional principle, which is yet to be articulated. Of course, I think the directional principle is just that of ontological priority. And that will allow the monist to state her conception of which way the direction should go. But a second problem, I should also mention that this direction of the reducing the large and few to the small and many also is potentially in conflict with Lewis's own primitive notion of naturalness, which he often glosses in terms of fundamentality. So Lewis himself allows that there are, he thinks, alien worlds on which there can be perfectly natural holistic properties of larger wholes at loose in the world. So at such worlds, if we have cases of symmetric supervenience between parts and wholes at such worlds, Lewis's analysis of reduction would say that the whole reduces to its parts, but his view of naturalness would say that the wholes are the more fundamental property bearers. So I think there's a potential tension lurking in using mereology as the direction of reduction in a system that also has naturalness floating around that can run in the other direction. But maybe the more telling difficulty, yet again one that emerges from looking at mereology and singleton formation side by side, is that none of these comments are applicable to singleton formation. The singleton relation is not many one, but one one, and I don't think there's any interesting sense in which the singleton is larger than its member. Indeed, for Lewis, the member and the singleton are both mereologically atomic. The singleton is probably best understood as not located in space-time at all, in which case maybe it's smaller than its member, or maybe size comparisons just don't even appropriately arise in that case. So what it seems to me we need is a more general conception of the directedness of the reduction. And Lewis doesn't really have the tools to state directedness in the right way. We could also do it, I should mention here, just in terms of naturalness, without going to mereology. For purposes of time, this is at the bottom of page 2 on your handout. I'm not going to talk about that here. There's problems with doing it that way in Lewis's framework as well. Lewis doesn't consider it, so I'll leave it for Q&A. Ask me about it if you're interested in how that might go. But I want to skip now to section 3. So I've argued so far that Lewis has a kind of hierarchical conception of ontology on which there are tiles, there's the mosaic, and the mosaic should be understood as reduced to and nothing over and above the tiles. In some sense, we need to better understand. And I've argued that Lewis's ways of understanding this in terms of identity, in terms of supervenience, and in terms of mereologically directed supervenience don't do justice to his notion of reduction. So whatever exactly the cautious reductionist wishes to say, I think it's not exactly what Lewis says. We've also seen in passing that Lewis has rejected using a relational notion of ontological priority, which here I'm treating as roughly equivalent to grounding, or at least to sort of Schaffer-style grounding. It's a bit different from Fine or Rosen-style grounding. We can talk about that if you're interested. But I think Lewis's reasons for rejecting ontological priority were unconvincing. So what I'm really kind of saying, to echo a phrase from Armstrong on causation, is that there was an open door for Lewis. The door was open for Lewis to say, ontological priority was the solution to my problems in understanding reduction. I should have posited it as a primitive, and then I could make better sense of my own hierarchical conception of ontology. And then I think the grounding theorist is the theorist who's going through that open door. Okay, so we've seen that Lewis, in the letter to Campbell that I quoted above, originally rejects ontological priority on grounds that composition is identity, but as we've seen, Lewis, and I think rightly, gives up the identity view in the composition case. Also, it's hopeless in the set theoretic case, and so that motivation for rejecting ontological priority as a way to understand hierarchy and reduction disappears from Lewis's considered views. We've also seen Lewis, sort of in passing, insult the notion of ontological priority as dubious and dark, and he seems to have a general complaint against the intelligibility of the notion. But of course, we all know that one of the things that Lewis says that he learns from Armstrong is that he needs some kind of posit of naturalness for properties, and that he's very happy taking that posit as a primitive posit, justified on grounds that it's a useful and needed notion, and he can't see how to have it in other ways. So Lewis could, by his own lights, kind of extended his naturalness playbook here and posited ontological priority likewise as a needed and useful notion that's not analyzable in terms of supervenience or in other terms. I should also mention that Lewis, what in his discussions with Campbell does seem to get the gist of the notion of ontological priority, so he doesn't think it's like completely unintelligible. And also, I should say that Lewis often glosses his own notion of perfect naturalness in terms of fundamentality. So there's kind of a natural, I won't be able to go into this here, but it's kind of natural to think of ontological priority as a kind of generalization of Lewisian naturalness for properties in two steps. First, for reasons I can't go into here, it would have been better for Lewis to have taken a notion, a comparative notion of more natural than as his primitive, as opposed to a categorical notion of perfectly natural. That's better because it works better in limitlessly complex worlds where there are no perfectly natural properties. But okay, I'm just going to assert that here. Once you have a comparative notion of more natural than for properties, ontological priority is just a generalization of that notion beyond the category of properties to individuals and entities generally. So in a way, I think that if you have a notion of ontological priority and you can apply it to properties, you can then recover the idea that some properties are prior to others, and then you can recover the idea that some properties are perfectly natural. Those are the properties for which no properties are more natural than them. So actually, you can still get by from a kind of like general Lewis-inspired framework with a very streamlined ideology where you replace perfect naturalness for properties with general ontological priority as your primitive ideology. So I feel like that would have been very much like a going option in a Lewis-y playbook to embrace this. That's what I genuinely think Lewis ought to have gone in for. Okay. But there's a third reason why you might think, Lewis would have resisted ontological priority. This is one I hear a lot, which is that it would involve some sort of brute modality, and so conflicted with this other aspect of Lewis's humane program, not the atomist part where it's just one little thing and then another, but the no necessary connections between distinct existence bit. And here, I just want to emphasize that Lewis understands distinct between distinct existence in purely mereological terms. But it's not clear why he restricts himself to that ideology. Once you have a notion of ontological priority, you can easily define a notion of what it is for entities to be metaphysically separate as follows. Two entities are metaphysically separate if neither is prior to the other, or as I like to say, neither grounds the other, and there's no further entity that grounds both. They have no common ground. A way to think about this is if we trace down the trees of ontological dependence between our two entities, they never converge in a common ground. So those entities are forever metaphysically separated in their dependence trees. And once we have that notion, we can then easily re-understand the humane ban as a ban on necessary connections between metaphysically separate entities, not just mereologically distinct, but metaphysically separate entities. And we can understand a question, you might wonder like, oh, hey, Lewis, why are mereologically connected entities exempted from the ban on necessary connections? And now we can answer, because parthood connections are, in the Lewis framework, they are priority connections. Parts are prior to their wholes. And so when entities are parthood connected, they're not metaphysically separate. But equally, we can say that when entities are membership connected, or at least singleton connected, like Socrates and singleton Socrates, then they're not metaphysically separate either, but the member is prior to its singleton. And so with ontological priority, we actually have the ideology at hand to extend the ban on necessary connections in just such a way as to make set formation, or singleton formation, if we just want to focus on that case, unmysterious vis-a-vis humane combinatorial principles. So it seems to me that the reasons why Lewis gives, or might have given, for rejecting ontological priority don't hold water, and that he ought to have embraced a primitive of ontological priority, or at any rate, I'd like to suggest that the door was open to Lewis to make better sense of reduction, and maybe even subsume his treatment of naturalness for properties, and improve his humane ban on necessary connections to not have to worry about set theory, by taking a notion of ontological priority as a primitive notion. So I'm now, and again, I just want to emphasize that I'm in agreement with Frederic and with Fraser that Lewis is rejecting grounding in ontological priority. I'm saying that that was a mistake on Lewis's part. With these ideological resources, we can restate Lewisian hierarchical ontology as follows. So atomism, there is a fundamental, ultimately prior ontology of many atomic individuals. As we survey the individuals at a given world and look for those for which nothing is prior to them, says the atomist, all we turn up are one little thing and then another. We have this notion of fusion for any things. There is a derivative, ontologically posterior thing that is their fusion, and we have singleton, or we can work more generally with set formation now, but I'll stick with singleton. For anything, there is a derivative class that is its singleton. So we're working in the notions of the fundamental and the derivative, or the prior and the posterior, in the way we are setting up the hierarchical ontology. And now we can make a number of, I think, very useful and insightful modifications. This is going to be rough because really to do the justice to this, we're going to need a more fully developed ideology of grounding with distinctions between full and partial ground and a number of other sort of core conceptual distinctions that I'm not going to try to spell out here, but we can re-understand the notion of combination in just the way that I spelled out earlier, to say that there are no necessary connections between separate individuals, metaphysically separate individuals. And that's a way of saying that metaphysical separation entails modal independence. We can re-understand Occam's razor in terms of what I call the laser, because it's more targeted, which says, do not multiply fundamental entities without necessity. And in so doing, we can make better sense of kind of Armstrongian free lunch principles, a better sense than either Armstrong or Lewis was able to make of these principles, which says that like fusions and sets or whatever you have in your abundant derivative superstructure, these are real entities, they exist, but it's not a cost to the theory to posit them, because once you posit the atomic individuals and you posit, let's say, the fusion operation, the wholes just fall out, just come out of the atomic individuals and the fusion operation automatically. We can understand, this has been my main focus here, we can better understand reduction by agreeing with Lewis that derivative entities exist and that they reduce to and are nothing over and above what is prior to them. And we've added something that's directional, that gives direction to how reduction works. And that's general enough to cover the mereological case and the set theoretic case, and is general enough to cover whatever other operations a metaphysician wishes to posit. So if, let's say, Casati and Varzi come in and want to posit a kind of whole with no W, whole formation operation that says if you have material hosts arranged in these ways, then you've got a whole parasitic upon them. Then we can see how the whole is parasitic, is a dependent entity as the output of this operation upon the more fundamental inputs. We can make sense of a notion of we can get a kind of one-way connection to supervenience in a way that Lewis would have agreed with, fix how things are fundamentally, and one fixes how things are simpliciter. This was part of Lewis's a priori reductionism that comes out in Reduction in Mind. All we're denying here is that there's a backwards path. We can't, from the fundamental derivative ontological priority relations, we can infer a supervenience pattern, but we can't go backwards and read off from supervenience what's more fundamental than what. And also, I'd say we can recover a notion of metaphysical explanation. This isn't something I've been able to go into here, but one of the big takeaways in the causal explanation literature is that we needed to go beyond, this is sort of what Salmon adds to Hempel, we need to go beyond deductive nomological relations to get a kind of directed connection in causal explanation, and that's given by adding causation, which is an asymmetric directed relation. And so in metaphysical explanation, I want to say the same thing. We need a kind of directed asymmetric connection to get comparable results for metaphysical explanation. Okay, so let me just conclude by saying what I think we will have gained by understanding Lewis's picture in a kind of augmented way, augmented with the ideology of ontological priority that Lewis himself would have disowned. I think we get a better understanding of the hierarchical view embedded in Lewis's metaphysics, and a better understanding of the way in which the existence of the outputs of the fusion and singleton operations are generated from, variant upon, and explicable via their inputs. So Lewis himself wasn't a grounding theorist, but he left the door open.